Today, the architecture of York reflects a much later English tradition. But look closely, and there is evidence of Vikings. 865, England faces a Norse nightmare. Along the east coast, a Viking invasion force of 2,000 men lands on undefended shores. Known as the Great Heathen Army, the Vikings are led by three brothers.
The father of these Viking brothers had himself been killed by Ella, the Anglo-Saxon ruler in York. And the tradition has it that they attacked York as revenge against Ella for the killing of their father, who was thrown into a snake pit.
Within a year, the Viking army marches on the old Roman city the English called Jorvik. In the brutal battle, they not only capture the city, but also its ruler, King Ella. Legend has it, the brothers take their revenge on him by carving the blood eagle.
The blood eagle is one of those quite violent methods of execution. The Vikings would cut the ribs in the back and expose the lungs, which would then flutter like an eagle in flight.
The Vikings then rebuild their captured city, giving it the Norse name of Jorvik.
The Vikings seem to have had a major impact and really over a couple of centuries to have transformed the city. They developed an area just beyond the Roman fortress, an area that's today the streets of Coppergate, and this is the area where we found a lot of our most important Viking Age finds.
In 1968, the York Archaeological Trust was formed to investigate and preserve the city's historic places. Richard Hall is one of its founders.
About 30 years ago, a local bank was putting in some new vaults, and we offered to dig these new vaults out for them.
The small excavation opens up a whole new world of Norse artifacts. Soon, other digs in York turn up even greater evidence of the city's Viking past.
We found the buildings that were constructed during the period of Viking rule, some of the best preserved buildings from this era ever found in Britain.
Here, Scandinavian artisans and craftsmen lived and worked in close quarters. The debris they trampled into the dirt floors remained as a legacy of their crafts.
There were smiths who were making knives and tools and some weapons as well. There were leather workers making shoes. There were textile makers churning out garments of all sorts. There were people importing silks from Byzantium to make into nice little silk caps, which were all the fashion in 10th century York. That's how they made their livings. They'd given up raiding. They'd become manufacturers and traders.
In addition to the houses, archaeologists find ancient trash pits called middens. These contain a wealth of microbial evidence.
We learned an awful lot about diet and farming practices from all the remains of the animal bones and the seeds and all the rest of it that we found. We could tell you about their health. We know that they suffered from tummy bugs.
But city life, with all its miseries, has never been an important part of Viking society. What the Vikings of the Great Heathen Army want is England's rich farmland. 866. After taking York, Viking armies fan out over all of northern England, seizing villages and appropriating farms. Over the next decade, the Vikings swallow whole kingdoms, defeating every army that musters against them, except one. In the south, King Alfred the Great of Wessex fights the Vikings to a standstill near the town of Edington.
It's the first battle in a long time that the Anglo-Saxons don't lose. And as a result, both the Viking and the Anglo-Saxon sides are willing to talk.
In the Treaty of Wedmore, King Alfred grants the Vikings all territories north of the Thames River, nearly half of England at that time.
Because in that area they had settled and Danish customs and Danish laws were now in operation, that area became the Danelaw.
The Danelaw is soon an attractive colony for Norse settlers. But unlike those who settled in Normandy, they bring their families with them, as well as their language and culture.
When you go out into the countryside around, you pass through villages that have Viking age names. They have Old Norse elements in their place names, and they were actually created, we're now beginning to realize, in the Viking period.
Governed by local assemblies known as things, the Vikings of the Danelaw leave a lasting impression on the English system of law and government, such as the advent of 12-man juries.
It is a system where the Vikings, to settle a dispute, will have 12 individuals who speak for one side or the other.
But as in other Norse-held territories, the Vikings of the Danelaw begin to blend in with the native population.
Old English and Old Norse are mutually intelligible. They probably conversed with each other. An Anglo-Saxon could live in one part of a valley, a Viking in the other. There was intermarriage between families of Norse and Anglo-Saxon origin.
The two languages also begin to merge. Many Viking words and phrases are adopted by the English, as well as aspects of Viking culture. The Yule log celebration is based on a pagan Viking ceremony, and Father Christmas is a Christianized version of an ancient Viking hero. By the end of the 10th century, the vast majority of Vikings in England have converted to Christianity. The result is a break in ties to their homelands and a lessening of Viking raids throughout the British Isles. But why did Vikings so readily convert to another faith? One reason may have been the dark nature of the Viking religion.
The end of the world for the Vikings was called Ragnarökr, and it means the doom of the gods. And Norse mythology is quite different from most mythology in that it starts out with the basic understanding that the gods will be destroyed by their enemies. It's usually rather the other way around. And the gods are thus not immortal.
Though local cults varied, the main gods of the Viking religion were common to all Scandinavia.
There was Odin, the god of war, Thor, the god of the rains and the sky. And then there were the major gods of fertility, Freya and Freyr, who are a twin pair, and women tended to worship Freya and men Freyr, and they were also connected with the fertility of the fields and the fertility of the families.
But overall, the Viking gods are a grim lot, at times demanding blood sacrifice, not only animals, but people. One chronicle of a 10th century pagan ceremony in Uppsala, Sweden, records that 99 people were sacrificed in one afternoon. But the bloody trappings of paganism soon alienated their English and French neighbors, and that was bad for business.
Clearly, Christianity was the coming thing by 1000. Virtually everybody in Northwestern Europe who had wealth, who had power, was Christian. If you were holding to pagan beliefs and pagan religion, you were going to be outside not only of religiously, but also economically and politically.
The conversion to Christianity, once it was in place, was one of the reasons for the end of the Viking Age.
But in England, the death blow would be dealt by a familiar enemy. The Norman invasion of 1066 at once transforms England into a centralized monarchy modeled on French feudal order and officially brings an end to the Viking Age. The renowned Bayeux Tapestry, commemorating the Battle of Hastings, depicts the English king Harold Godwinson losing his kingdom and his life. William the Bastard, the victorious Duke of Normandy and a direct descendant of the Viking Rollo, is forever after known as William the Conqueror.
Ultimately, rather ironic that this Viking descendant brought the French language, in many ways the French culture, but when you look at the Bayeux Tapestry, you can see it may have been French, but it was very much Viking as well.
Although the Normans are shown with French-style armor and weapons, their ships are of Viking design. Even as the Viking Age comes to an end in England, in the far northwest, the age of the Icelandic sagas has just begun. It is a time of far-flung adventure and tremendous hardship. When we return, the Viking discovery of a whole new world.
Eric the Red is a great example of the Viking Age. He's a pushy, aggressive, greedy fella who becomes a renowned and wise leader at the end.
In 1963, Boy Scouts in Denmark built a replica of a Viking warship, partly to see if it could actually transport horses, as illustrated on the Bayeux Tapestry. The ship easily carried horses and scouts on the open sea. History's Mysteries will continue here on the History Channel. We now return to Vikings, Fury from the North on History's Mysteries.
Even as the age of Viking dominance ebbs in England, to the frigid north, another Viking society is about to take shape, Iceland. Today, Viking history and culture remain very much alive in Iceland. It is the only place where the Old Norse language has survived nearly intact. Deep in an underground vault beneath the Arne Magnusson Institute of Reykjavik are kept a treasury of stories, a history of the Viking age passed down by the Vikings themselves, the Icelandic sagas.
The Vikings were great storytellers. There were long nights, long winters, and we know that they told stories at home. We know that they told stories in the Viking encampments.
The sagas make up one of the richest literary traditions of medieval Europe. Written on vellum, a form of calf's skin scraped paper thin, the sagas are family histories, as well as tales of war, blood feuds, and dangerous voyages into the unknown.
A lot of the sagas talk about lands being discovered by accident as people were blown off course.
One of the sagas tells the tale of a Norwegian named Floki who set sail in the year 860 with the hope of founding a new colony.
The traditional story of how Iceland got its name was a nasty surprise that an early explorer got. Coming to Iceland, expecting to find that this was a warm and friendly place, the story is given that he didn't collect enough fodder to get his animals through the first winter. And then, seeing the land still snow-covered, gave the country its name today, rather unfairly.
But Floki's party is not discouraged by Iceland's forbidding name.
By 870, the literary sources tell us that the great immigration to Iceland began, and this was one of the great movements of peoples across the Atlantic. 10 to 20,000 people in a period of 60 years came.
Rejecting the monarchies that had seized power in Scandinavia, the independent Vikings of Iceland set up a government of their own. In 930, one of the first proto-democratic assemblies in Western European history is born, the Icelandic Althing.
The Althing met for 2 weeks in June every year, and all the chieftains of Iceland, with a following of freemen who then worked as judges, had to come to the Althing.
A raucous Viking festival, the Althing is held among the red lava cliffs of Thingvellir, a volcanic rift not far from Reykjavik.
It's sort of a magical place in many respects. It was magical also in the sense that this is where people came together from all over Iceland to dispute, to settle land claims, to settle feuds. Exchanges were made, marriages were set up, sales were contracted. It was a very busy place.
But as their island grows more crowded, the Vikings face hard times.
Iceland in the 8th and 9th century was a very different place than it is today. According to the written sources, Iceland was forested from the mountains to the sea. This is a place where you could let your pigs run loose in the birch forest, and today there's not a tree for 100 miles.
In 970, 100 years after settlement began, Iceland suffers widespread famine. The sagas tell us that food becomes so scarce, people are forced to eat ravens and foxes. About the same time, a young, red-haired Viking sails to Iceland to escape a sentence of death for killing a man in Norway.
Eric the Red is a great example of the Viking age. He's a pushy, aggressive, greedy fella who becomes a renowned and wise leader at the end.